Hey, we are starting lesson 6, and we are going to be focusing on release, the word release. Sometimes when you hear a word mentioned over and over again in a text, it's because it's important. And in this text, we hear that word a lot, so that's going to be a focus for today. We're going to talk about that in a lot more in depth. But before we do, whenever I ended lesson 5, I ended with the exit ticket question. When Jonas goes into detail about that flashback with throwing the apple with his friend Asher and something transpiring with that apple, it's like what the question was, what does this memory reveal about Jonas's community? And what does it reveal about Jonas? And I want to just kind of go over that. So Jonas's community is constantly under watch by those who are in charge. Even the smallest infraction, they are noticed. Taking one apple does not seem like a big deal. But the speakers share that public announcement as a reminder that snacks should not be hoarded. So in addition, Jonas's community seeks to control people's actions by making them public. Instead of having a person remind Jonas that he should not take snacks, an announcement was made for everybody in the community to hear and to know. So that suggests that the community and the people in it follow the rules and order, because if not, it will be brought to everyone's attention that you didn't, and you will be publicly humiliated, embarrassed. So it's like this is, Jonas does believe he's seeing something. And when he asks the question to Asher, he realizes that Asher doesn't see it. So he kind of blows it off, And that's one of the questions that you have to answer also. But even though he doesn't know how to explain it, that's why he's mystified, because it's a mystery. So he can't put it into words exactly. He's bewildered, he's baffled. It's strange to him. It leaves him questioning, leaves him wondering. Something is going on. And he knows he's not crazy. He knows that something changed, something happened. But it's the first time that we as the reader get to see that Jonas is experiencing something that's different, and it's something that no one else in the community is experiencing. So that's the exit ticket review. Now, again, we're going to go into 6. If you did not read chapter 4 or 5, that's fine. Chapter 5 is really not necessary to the point of the giver. So don't worry about that whatsoever. And it's 25 chapters, and we have lots of work to do, so you don't even have to worry with that. In chapter 4, the biggest thing that we're going to focus on is the word release and what it could mean. So that's where we're going to focus our attention at this time. You're going to notice a conversation if you did read chapter 4, but Jonas has a conversation with an elderly lady. See, Jonas has friends, and his good friend, as we know, is Asher, but he also there's a chapter 4 we kind of introduced to a friend of his that's a girl, and her name is Fiona, and it says he likes Fiona. They get along well. And she likes to volunteer at the House of the Old, and so does Jonas. And so in chapter 4, they go to the house of the old and they're doing their volunteer hours and they're helping the elderly, and they bathe the elderly because they're too feeble and they need help. But Jonas has a conversation with an elderly lady named Larissa. And in the conversation, she says, "Oh, we celebrated a release today. And it was Roberto." So when she starts talking about that, Jonas says, "Well, I remember Roberto. He had been there a couple weeks earlier, and he remembered Roberto." So Jonas thought Larissa had, "This morning we celebrated the release of Roberto," she told him. "It was wonderful." "I know Roberto," Jonas said. "I helped him with his feeding the last time I was here, just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man." Larissa opened her eyes happily. "They told his whole life before they released him," she said. "They always do." Okay. So on page 40, "But to be honest," she said, she whispered with a mischievous look, "some of the tellings are a little boring. I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during tellings when they released Edna recently." So she's talking about the release. Okay. But in this case, it's like it was a wonderful thing for Roberto to be released. So when you go over to page 41, well, they were telling of his life. That's always first. Then the toast. We all raised our glasses and cheered. We chanted the anthem. He made a lovely goodbye speech, and several of us made little speeches wishing him well. I didn't, though. I've never been fond of public speaking. He was thrilled. You should have seen the look on his face when they let him go." And so then Jonas asked this question, "Larissa, what happens when they make the actual release? Where exactly did Roberto go?" And she lifted her bare, wet shoulders in a small shrug. "I don't know. I don't think anybody does, except the committee. He just bowed to all of us and walked, like they all do, through the special door in the releasing room. But you should have seen his look. Pure happiness, I'd call it." Jonas grinned. "I wish I'd been there to see it." And then Larissa frowned, and she's like, "I don't know why they don't let children come. It's not enough room, I guess. They should enlarge the releasing room." "Well, we'll have to suggest that to the committee. Maybe they'll study it." "Maybe they'd study it," Jonas said slyly, and Larissa chortled with laughter. "Right," she hooted, and Jonas helped her from the tub, because anything that they say the committee will study, then the committee never makes a decision. It's like a joke. But you have attached in the Google Classroom, a Google document, is an incident chart. And it says, in the chart below, track incidents in which being release is discussed in the text. In the left-hand column, note the incident by citing textual evidence. And that describes the release in specific page numbers. It's just easier to find if you go ahead and put the page number, because you're probably going to refer back to it. In the second column, record your observations and inferences about what this suggests about how release is viewed. So page 39, this morning we celebrated the release of Roberto. She told him it was wonderful. So that's what you would write, literally. Or type it in your Chromebook. Page 39. This morning, we celebrated the release of Roberto. She told him it was wonderful. And then, how's it viewed? Hey, she described it as wonderful. Something to be celebrated. It was a joyous occasion. It makes me think almost it almost made me think like a funeral. But he was there, or like it really did make me think of a funeral, but he hadn't passed away. Like, they celebrated his release, but like he had a smile on his face, almost, I guess, like a retirement, but he was leaving. So I guess it's a cross between a retirement and a funeral. But he did literally leave. Like, they didn't see him anymore. But it was a very pleasant, for the elderly man, it was very, very good. So that was one entrance. And then on the next line, I have page 41. Lewis explains more about Roberto's release and how he felt about it. Page 41. Well, there was the telling of his life. So see, that's just more evidence where we find out what's actually happening. At first, she says, on 39, she said we celebrated the release. But on 41, she goes into more detail. So I just jot that down. I just jotted the details down. That's the textual evidence. So that's almost like, it almost feels like a retirement party, where they just kind of celebrated that they had a toast, they cheered, they chanted an anthem, a lovely goodbye speech, and even in another paragraph, but in the same section, I do say that, she's not really sure where he's going, but on the side where it was like, well, how's it viewed by Jonas, or how's it viewed by the community? Again, this is positive, this is good. But the reason why I have it on even though we're still talking about the same person, it's more information being shared. It's more details being provided. That's why I have it as more. Yes, it's still Roberto, but it's more details being provided. That's why it's listed again, okay? So you're asked, you need to go on back to chapter 1, if you would. Just take a look back there. And if you'll remember, just almost immediately in chapter 1, we are taken into a flashback where he remembers whenever he was feeling that word frightened. Whenever the jet flew over, and what was the response of the person, the speaker. And this was, and I had said, I write in my book, I just circled the entire sentence because this sentence is in all caps. And if you have your book, you'll see on page 3, this sentence is in all capital letters. So it really stands out in my mind. Needless to say, he'll be released. So that's what I wrote down in chapter 1, the pilot who mistakenly flew over Jonas's community. And it's what it's reported. He misread. That's what they told us anyway. So we don't have anything to suggest that it's not the case. But he mistakenly flew over Jonas's community against the rules. He's released. The text says, needless to say, he will be released. So that was scary to me to think about that in their little world. Let me do this again. Okay. And then the reaction, and it's almost, and then Jonas even said that he picked up on it was an amusing kind of attitude that that speaker had. The speaker found it amusing. I thought that was a big deal. It was described as amusing. But Jonas said, if you'll go back to page 3, make sure you put the page numbers in these entrance, and when you fill this out, so you can go back and refer to this. But how does Jonas and the community feel about being released, or what does it say again? How is it viewed by Jonas and the community? If you are not, like if you're born and there's something wrong, like the nurturer, the father who's a nurturer, he knows if there's something wrong with a child, they may have to be released. He doesn't like that because he kind of, we're going to get into that. But if you live a long life and you're released, you're celebrated. We just read evidence of that. Those are positives. So that's where we would say release would be, would be really sad as an infant. But it would be for an older person in our mind, we don't really understand exactly what's going on in this story yet. But for a person to have lived a long life, we feel like that's a positive. But on page 3, let's go back and look. For a contributing citizen, so if you contributed, which means if you contribute, you do your part for society to work. For a contributing citizen to be released from the community, that, in other words, all of a sudden, if the committee decides that you, as a citizen, need to be released, that's a final decision, a terrible punishment, an overwhelming statement of failure. So somewhere along the way, you have become a failure, so that would be regarded as very negative because you're done. So if it is death, that's it. If it's banishment for you to be released, you're not coming back. If they're kicking you out of the community, either way, to be released in this regard, that's it. So this is something that nobody wanted to be released until they got older. Okay. Now, do you remember on page 9 when Mother shares her feeling that night? And she's like a lawyer, like, because she works for the Justice Department. And she has worry. She feels worry. And she says that she's had to go back to page 9. She uses that word. I'm sorry. It's not 9. It's 11. I need to make a change right there. My apologies. I feel frightened too for him. That there's no third chance. The rules say that if there's a third transgression, he simply has to be released. So this man had come before her a second time. She had already punished him, and he's done come before her a second time. So it was the father that was feeling the worry over Gabe at that time. So I misspoke. I apologize. But the mother is feeling frustration and anger and even guilt about this man that she had to see in her court, or that she didn't use the word court, but he came before her today. She said this offender, a repeat offender, because if he messes up, he will have to be released. There's that word again. But the father does actually use that word. What does he say about Gabriel? Do you remember? Well, you go find it and jot that down and say how they feel about it, about how does the father feel as the nurturer if an infant had to be released. How would he really feel about it? If you can find any evidence to support that. I think there's some there. And then on page, let's see. There's another situation. You'll have to find the page number because I think I wrote the wrong one down. Or do you remember where Jonas thinks about a boy who's his age? He's 11 years old. And he remembers about his father had to be released. Do you remember reading that? Well, go find it and put it down because that's evidence in the text about the word released. And then how is that viewed? That example of being released. How is that viewed in the community? So you do that, okay? Okay. So now you will need to read chapter 6 and 7. And we will start with lesson 7.